So this session, as I just mentioned, as we were kind of getting set for today's session here, is how to approach should cost modeling. As I mentioned, it's a really important tool for both products and services, particularly when we have all the upward cost pressures that we just talked about in the last session, trying to determine the validity of some of those cost increase requests. So just a reminder, we'd love to see as much conversations as the chat as possible. I think that's it's been really dynamic so far. So long may that continue in this session. With that said, Jake, I'm going to go in the background here, and I will leave it to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Pip, thank you for sharing. Brief introduction. My name is Jake Taylor. I am a director at Procurability. I have almost 20 years of procurement consultancy experience. So in the field, doing a lot of the work that we're going to be talking about. So I don't just have chalk dust on my hands doing trainings, even though I love doing trainings on behalf of clients and other consultancies, but really sharing some of the findings and that are real world experiences that my clients have been dealing with over the years. And it is interesting, great lead into this session from the previous discussions. Should cost modeling, also called clean sheeting, depending on which firm or where these models are coming from, are really coming back in vogue. They were popular from my perspective about 10 years ago. And then when there's downward pressure on prices, they kind of go away because, let's be honest, as procurement professionals, we could go to the old tricks and still extract savings. But when there's upward pressures, inflationary, rising prices, just doing an RFP year over year with the same supply base will get diminishing returns. So we have to kind of reach into our toolkit and get some of those advanced models and practices out. And this is one of those. And it's a very powerful tool in our toolkit to really challenge our suppliers to give you more negotiating leverage. And that's really ultimately what a should cost model is more information. We talked at the top of the sessions about data, the plethora of data. This is using data in a powerful way to really challenge the incumbent suppliers or new suppliers that you have. Similar examples, right? So when a supplier, whether it's directs, indirects, services, materials, comes back to you with a price increase due to raw material increases. This happened to me 10 years ago with a nonprofit who bought tons and tons of t-shirts. So they do a lot of events where they give out t-shirts to participants. And there was, if you remember 10 years ago, cotton destruction and the raw materials shot through the roof. Tried to pass that on to this nonprofit client of mine. Clearly above and beyond what the cost should have been. Does anyone know, just curious offhand, if you can just put into chat, what do you think for a $15 t-shirt? Apologies for our European friends that have dialed in using a US example here, but for a $15 t-shirt, what percentage is cotton pricing? Just curious if anyone, maybe someone buys t-shirts and knows this, but obviously very simple example, but what do you guys think is cotton pricing in a relatively inexpensive t-shirt? All right, all over the board. Looks like 5% up to 50%, average maybe around 10%. It is 6.7% of a $15 t-shirt is cotton pricing. So when a supplier comes back and says we need to raise pricing 50% due to cotton fields being destroyed, raw materials going through the roof, you need to be able to challenge that. You may know that's bluster, but then the point is, what is a fair price to push back on, right? If you're busy and you're dealing with fires from your line of business, how do you manage what is a fair ask, a fair increase for inflationary or even raw material price increases? So that's the point of a should cost model. It is something you develop on your own. It's not necessarily something you put into an RFP and ask the suppliers for their price components. So you have an unbundled pricing because that can be all over the map. So when you're developing a should cost model, it's your own, call it proprietary insight into what the cost should be for your supply base. And as this slide shows here, this is part of an overall category management plan. As category managers, category leads, buyers, right? The information you have to be able to effectively negotiate with your supplier is really based on the knowledge you have of their inputs. And some of it you're going to have to estimate, right? It's clearly the secret sauce for a lot of our suppliers of what their price inputs are. They're not going to pass that on to you willingly. But if there's one thing that I do try to pass on, I also do negotiating training, that pricing is fictitious, right? So whenever a supplier passes a price on to you through an RFP or sticker price, or even retail shopping, luxury goods, it's psychology. It's, yes, based on what some of the inputs are to make that product, or paying a resource for a service, but it's what they think you're willing to pay for that product. And maybe you negotiate, but at the end of the day, it's a fictitious price, at least a starting point. So this gives you basically more insights into again, negotiating and giving you more leverage. So as part of this unbundling and should costing, it'll be one of the many pieces to give you more information. So next slide, please. So some of the objectives here of should costing, and we already talked about a number of these, so due to time, I might go through some of this quickly. And just a point, please in the chat, put any questions that you might have. I will promise to get to them. It may not be right in the middle of no doubt a pithy point that I might be making, but I'll get back to any questions that you have. So not just at the end. But again, supporting fact-based negotiations, cost reductions when they come to you. What is a fair price increase? Can you hedge away some of that price increase? Looking at analyzing unique projects. So micro benchmarking is really not just looking at the overall cost, but the actual piece or element that's in play here. An example of manufacturing and raw materials. What is that percentage of raw materials that you're talking about? Suppliers will bluster their way into price increasing. Some buyers are as sophisticated as others and may take that. They're busy. They have other major important parts to understand and deal with, and they just path of least resistance will pass through a price increase. Suppliers are feeling out who that is and who they can do that with. So micro benchmarking is just looking at certain components of an overall material that you want to investigate. And then finally, trade-offs. Again, as I said, most all of us as procurement professionals are busy. We have a lot on our plate, multiple RFPs, dealing with stakeholders that want a new supplier started last week. Doing an in-depth should cost takes time and might not have the ROI associated with it. So you would not do an ROI, or sorry, should cost in every situation. Okay, next slide, please. So when thinking about should cost, it's important to think about it's different than a lot of us think naturally about pricing, which is you have your baseline and you paid for the last X number of years. You have data that supports backward-looking information. We think of pricing that adds to the price. So inflationary pressures, as we've been talking about, price increasing, coming from the supplier year over year, and you try to hedge away as much of that as you can. That is the traditional view of looking at pricing, the will cost. What you paid plus a certain amount that suppliers ask for, that maybe you can negotiate some of it away, will lead to a will cost. And this is really a self-fulfilling prophecy of assuming that pricing does go up over time. And in some situations, it will. As procurement professionals, it's our job to negotiate away as much of that as we can, and ideally lower costs. Clearly, we all are incentivized to lower our costs and take cost out, price out, increase value, as I prefer to say, with our suppliers and with the products and services that we're buying. But the way to think about should costing, it's really challenging that status quo. It's not your current cost plus or minus a certain amount will lead to the will costs. It's whatever your baseline is with knowledge about what those price inputs are will lead to the should cost, which ideally will be a reduction over time. Again, more information, more insights, more data, not simply taking the RFP price that is submitted from a supplier or a price quote from a supplier and you compare to all of the other bids. I love RFPs, right? It's the best benchmark for your situation with your client or with your company's spend at that situation, but it doesn't always give you the best leverage to challenge pricing. The should costing will, if done correctly, will enable you to do that. And it's an important point I should make as well, that if done incorrectly, you will lose some leverage. If you go to your supplier and say, you're asking, you think pricing should increase 4%, we say it's 2% because your raw material prices only affect 6.7% of a t-shirt. If that's off, if that's wrong, and clearly your suppliers will know this, you will lose that leverage and negotiating ability to challenge that pricing, and they'll know you're coming not from a position of strength and knowledge, but more from from bluster than anything else, which doesn't work. So moving on, please, Pip. So a key question I get from a lot of our clients is, okay, before we dive into how to do a should cost model, where do I get this information? You're telling me to build up a knowledge base on our suppliers where this is their industry, their company. I'm just working at an IT or a bank, and I don't know how other companies' profit centers look. I don't know how they negotiate with their supply base. Where can I get this information? The first and foremost, a lot of these are obvious for you guys, so I won't go into too much detail here, but it's people, right? Really leverage your peer network is the best source of information using art of procurement and, a function like this, but then following up, having one-on-one meetings or even forums, cities. I've been involved with the Bay Area Procurement Council, which is all procurement buyers in the Bay Area, regardless of industry or products, to get together, do networking events, and then break off into talking about IT buying and temp labor buying. I know there's one in Chicago and New York, London. I lived for a couple of years. There's a couple of good ones in London as well, or even by industry, right? So IT buyers and so forth. This is really your best source. And, without giving out proprietary information that might be deemed competitive, to really get a good view into what your peers are doing and how they're handling negotiating. Are you doing should cost modeling is really helpful and effective. And then additionally, as Joe pointed out this morning, right, there's just so much data that's out there. It might be almost too much data that's, you need to cleanse, and it might not be worth the effort to go down this path. But, there's SAP data, Coupa, all of your ERP systems, spend analytics, P2P information. And I do also want to point out, it might not be sexy or fun, but the documents themselves, if you need to pull documents and go through them, do a 80-20 rule and look at the big, contracts and try to pull relevant information out of the contracts or invoices is a great source of information, even though it's a big lift to do that. So also plenty of external sources, consultancies, sorry, free plug here, right? We have our own data intelligence, market intelligence group that provides benchmarking, relevant information. I'm sure there's other consultancies that do the same thing, as well as market intelligence. Industry periodicals and reports are a great source of information, as well as obviously publicly available data. We use Bureau of Labor Statistics. It might not be easy to go through all of the government data to your relative country, but it is useful. So. Okay, let's move on then, Pip. So similar, but not exactly the same as the situation we're talking about here are teardowns. So a lot of organizations are doing teardowns for competitive intelligence. So if you're Apple and you're looking at Samsung, it's competitive intelligence to understand their cost inputs. So you can, as I mentioned, since pricing is fictitious, determine the pricing for your products. But it's really the same concepts. It's looking at the core components, understanding what are the pricing of those components, where are they manufactured, what are some of the specs and so forth. That if you're buying complex machinery or inputs, that this is the kind of information that you're going to need to be doing yourself to really be able to negotiate with contract manufacturers, with companies that are providing some of those key specs and components and so forth. So with that, wanted to lead into, if you go to the next slide, please, Pip, a real world example of a should cost model. And I'll try not to be too academic here. I do a full day training on this, and this is obviously pared down for a half-hour session, but for pallets. I don't know if anyone has sourced pallets or deals with pallets. It's a relatively straightforward product. It's just some wood hammered together, right, to move product around your warehouse or to ship it out. But it is an amazing category as far as the players, how competitive it is, how ruthless it is. I learned a ton about pallets in this industry, having sourced it a few times and dealing with this, and did a should cost model for one of my clients for pallets. So this is an example. It's a 40 by 40 to 48 by 40 hardwood GMA pallet produced in American Canyon. That's Northern California. If anyone's a pallet nerd, stringer class, double face, non-reversible, partial four-way, multi-use new manufacturer. So you do an RFP. It's very regional. So you do it in American Canyon for this plant, and they come back average pricing for this very specific type of pallet, and pallets are very specific. $12.10 is the average bid price. Your incumbent is $14.10. So probably very typical example, regardless of the category, regardless of an RFP, $2 more for your incumbent than everybody else. You do the cost benefit analysis. Is it worth it to have a new supplier? Well, we don't know. And the plant manager's yelling, you can't switch my incumbent because if the pallets don't come in, we can't ship out product. So how is then they say the category manager for pallets? How are you going to manage this potential price increase from your incumbent? Do you have leverage to potentially challenge them? Can you just come back to them and say you're higher in the market than everyone else? Typically incumbents will say, we're better, right? We have better service. We have all these reasons you should stick with us. So to do this, you would build a should cost model, right? You look at the cost of materials, cost of labor, production, what's the overhead for a pallet. So there's a number of ways to do this. And if we can go to the next slide, Pip. So a bit of a busy slide here, so apologies. So when you come back with your RFP and you build your should cost, and one way to do this is to ask in the RFP, okay, here's all the key components of a pallet. Tell us your cost prices. What percentages of your pallet is wood, nail, stenciling, and so forth. I found this not just with pallets, but with other categories, insightful, but not really actionable because it's all over the map. So the most effective way to do this is to do this on your own, right? To build it up with as much intelligence as you can. So in this case, with wood, we determined that it's a 70% vast majority, no surprise, of a pallet is wood, right? It's a certain type of wood that we determined, okay, it's in the following slide, which I'll get to in a second. We'll kind of go through this, let's just talk about the wood price, right? The vast majority of the cost here. So if you're looking at the average bid cost, 70%, that's $847. Sorry, it's a little small on my screen. Yeah, $847. Whereas if you looked at the should cost, then that's $625. That's basically a $2 difference of what the average bid cost is into what you're saying the should cost is of 70% of a pallet, of a full-born pallet cost. That gives you some market intelligence to say, okay, so it's basically, $2 less incumbent than what you're saying, not just you're $2 more expensive in the marketplace, because that carries less weight than by saying you're kind of overburdening your wood cost by 2%. So I see here in the comments some of the profit margin is challenged a little bit. That also depends very much on location, right? So location of where the pallets are coming from. But I'll get to that in a second. So with this type of insight around should costing of the main component, 70%, that's a $2 increase that isn't justified purely by an RFP with competitors. So I'm seeing a question here, what happens with a wood shortage? Well, that would be an increase then in an index price if there's truly a wood shortage, which you can track, which you could see the pricing of. And pallets is a very local business. So for any manufacturing center, it doesn't make sense to ship pallets more than roughly 300 miles. So you're never going to really, if it's a rental pallet, perhaps get pallets more than 250 miles away from your plant or distribution center. So what happens then is these plants, the mills that are near your plants will have production on hand, production supply on hand. Otherwise, they're buying off the open market, which you could track the pricing of. Okay, and with that point, I think the next slide, Pip, would be useful here, just quickly to go through this for time, and I won't go into too much detail. But the question we get then too is if you're buying pallets, it's hard to estimate what that true should cost be for 70% of wood. So in this case, excuse me, this type of wood is green Douglas fir, which is again in the Northwest because it's a pallet in Northern California that you could find through an index that, 30 board feet of green Douglas fir is required to build one 48 by 40 pallet, and that is $6.25. It takes some effort to determine exactly how much wood in this case, or how much rare earth minerals go into some of the components that you're going to be purchasing. But this is a level of information that would be refined over time. Again, if you could find your peers that are also buying pallets, talk to your suppliers, ask them how much wood goes into one of these pallets. I found that suppliers and people in general love to talk about themselves and what they do and their jobs. They are a great source of information. They will readily give some of this information up to basically give you some of these inputs and insights. So then you could track over time to the question around if wood shortage, the price on a market indices for wood will go sky high. So this is just, again, tracking. Again, you wouldn't do this for every component, for the nails, for the stenciling. But if a product is 70% of one input, as pallets are with this type of wood, this would be a good component to track over time and see the pricing of. Because if pricing is rising and going through the roof, suppliers are going to ask for an increase. They won't ask for a decrease when it goes down, which is, in this example, is a few years ago now, what we saw happening. So any price increasing wouldn't be justified. I see a comment on recycled pallets. It's a little bit of a different market for recycled or even plastic pallets or rental pallets, different strategies. But this is if you're buying a new or basically remanufactured pallet. Okay, so I also want to make a comment about estimating profit margin, which I saw there's a comment earlier on. So it's an inexact science at best, right? So for private companies, there's very little information available on this. But for public companies, you can estimate it, you can plug it in. It might be difficult to what is SG&A versus profit. Sometimes those get bundled together. But again, if you remember from your undergraduate accounting days, your profit margin is just your net income over your total revenue. Public companies, this is readily available. Private, they're not going to want to readily give that up because that goes into the margins. Although, how many times do you hear from your suppliers, we're at no margin, we're barely surviving with our margins. We've passed it all on to you. Again, bluster, a little bit of fact base and research will kind of help with some of this. Just in this example that we did with pallets, there was a nationwide pallet provider that pulled from local mills, but they were basically a distributor of pallets, that they had a 4% profit margin. Just looking at basically their annual reports, you could find that relatively easily, which kind of helps with, okay, what is the profit margin roughly for pallets, right? It's not the 0.1% that a lot of them will say they are, that it's a high margin, a high volume business, and that's where they make their money. There is a little bit of margin baked into pallets. And just as an example, right, Apple, right, 21% margin, profit margin. So if someone like an Apple, maybe a extreme example here, but if there's someone like an Apple that's trying to say, oh, we have no margin, we can't pass on any price savings onto you because we're already as flat as we can be because you've been pounding us for years on price, depending on the company, that's probably not the case. So, all right, next slide, please, Pip. So one other point here is this is a living document, right? You're going to have to refine it over time. You're probably going to be a little off on some of your margins, as we talked about, your percentages of wood, in this case with pallets. It will get better over time as you refine them and you work on them. And all your components change, as we've talked about. Inflationary pressures, raw materials pricing, supplier dynamics, especially if it's an industry where there's a lot of buying and selling and there's one key dominant player. And then another one is government regulations. This applies a lot to services with temp labor, where there's a lot of changing with, I remember 10 years ago with the ACA, there's a lot of changes to the markup, and how will that markup be affected due to government regulations for resources and healthcare and so forth. So a lot of that plays into both materials and services as well. So, and then finally, some final thoughts. Really think of should cost modeling as a tool in your toolkit. It's not always applicable. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of hard work to do to collect this, to have it be correct. As I mentioned, if it's an off basis, you lose some credibility with your supply base if you kind of come to them and try to negotiate based off of that. So easing into negotiations with one. So use it where appropriate, when appropriate, especially when RFP results are diminishing. And again, increases your power dynamic, and continue to monitor, continue to update. And I think is also, as Alex mentioned in the previous session, the next step after a should cost model is really open book pricing, right? As a key supplier, a strategic supplier will say, okay, we see what you're trying to do. Why don't we work with you to kind of open up our books? If you open up your demand, we can become closer as suppliers. So get back away from this kind of price concession type of relationship, which is what should modeling is really the key to unlocking that relationship.
Well, Jake, I want to thank you. I know we're running up against time, but I do have one other question.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a question without a definitive answer, but I know we're all really pressed for time, and kind of running from one emergency to another right now. As you think about building a should cost model for the first time, is there how much time does it take? Or does it have to be a big initiative, or is it something that can be done relatively quickly?
Well, I hate to give the typical consulting answer, but it depends. It depends on the category. It depends on urgency, the supply base that you're working with, right? To do one for pallets is relatively straightforward. You could probably do it, in a handful of days to a week with, need for refine and review, of course, where if you're building a should cost model for, if you're Ford and you're looking at an engine, then that's going to take a little bit more time. But it's definitely an ROI question. Is it worth the effort to, build one when you are so busy, resource constraints? But a properly built should cost model is incredibly powerful. It gives you so much leverage that you need to be choosy and particular in where and which categories you do it for. But it's definitely worth the effort when you do one.
Well, thank you, Jake. I know we're distilling a really complex topic into half an hour from a day of training material. So I really want to appreciate you, Ken, giving us the insights that you have done. Of course, folks, if you want to connect with Jake outside of the event, please feel free to do so as well. So with that being said, I think we're ready for the Category Palooza encore. We are up next with Betsy, who's going to help us bring everything that we talked about today all together into one place. So we talked about building our category strategies.